This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Connecticut has made significant strides to reduce homelessness in our state, but challenges remain that contribute to housing instability. A lack of affordable housing is a big factor. A report by the State Department of Housing says Connecticut has a shortage of 86,000 affordable rental units. Coming up, Where We Live, we talk about this, including the need for more multifamily homes in communities outside of the state's major cities. Now, my first guest has experience working on this issue. She's the former first select woman of Darien, and then she became the state's first housing commissioner. Now, Yvonne Klein is the nonprofit CEO of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. Yvonne, welcome to the show.
Morning, Lucy. Happy to be here.
And congratulations on your appointment. I understand you were interim before being announced as the permanent CEO of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. So I wanted to begin because I mentioned you were a former housing commissioner for the state. You were actually the first housing commissioner, the Governor Malloy creating the Department of Housing, I believe, back in 2013. During your time and his time in office, Connecticut made some national distinctions and progress when we think about ending chronic homelessness among veterans. And so it's been many years now since that time, and now that you're in this nonprofit role, what are some of the big areas of concern that you have when we look at homelessness in our state?
Well, thank you again, and happy to be here with everyone this morning. When we look at the work that we did under Governor Malloy, it certainly was vast. We didn't have a Department of Housing for over 30 years, and housing and homelessness issues essentially were, in some ways, were backburnered in the state of Connecticut. And when the Department of Housing was created, we looked at housing on a spectrum. And it was a continuum from homelessness all the way up to home ownership. What are those things that we can do as a state to make a difference in the lives of Connecticut residents? So during that time, we were very fortunate to work together with all of our providers to end veteran homelessness in the state of Connecticut. We were only one of 3 states to achieve that distinction. And we continue to be a state that has effectively ended homelessness among our veterans. And it was first ending homelessness among chronically homeless veterans, and then those who had acute experiences with homelessness. We also, during that time, worked hard to end chronic homelessness in the state, which we essentially achieved, but need to get back on track to addressing chronic homelessness within the state of Connecticut. So clearly, as our numbers decrease in the state, we do see some increases among our families. So, you will see us focusing on ending chronic homelessness among individuals, and also you'll see a focus on ending family homelessness as well as youth homelessness.
Let's look more at the numbers. When we look at the data, Connecticut experienced a 32.7% decline in homelessness between 2010 and 2020. But there has been a sharp increase in what's called unsheltered homelessness when we look at the pandemic, Yvonne. So talk about that. What are we seeing?
So I think folks know what unsheltered homelessness is, right? It's someone who could be living literally on the street, in a car, in a bus, in an abandoned building, really where people should not be living. So we did during the pandemic see an uptick, and proud to say that our providers worked very hard during the pandemic to keep folks safe during this time, and were able to decompress shelters as well as house people during this very difficult time. So although we did see an uptick in unsheltered homelessness overall, we do see a decrease. I think what you see is, you'll see numbers change over a course of time. But the pandemic, as you can imagine, was very difficult on folks as they were losing employment and so on.
So when we talk about people that are living on the streets or living somewhere, like, as you mentioned, that's not suitable for habitation, thinking about last year, there was so much federal money that was able to help Connecticut and other states with extended hotel stays to help declutter shelters in the pandemic. But what's happening now? Are the shelters filling up again, Yvonne?
So, clearly our shelters are, it's winter. We have seen, folks take shelter in our shelters. But yes, I'd like to talk a little bit about the federal funding. Yes, our providers were able to use that funding to, as I had mentioned, and you had mentioned, to decompress the shelters so that we were able to keep folks safe. And that was a very successful effort, done very quickly. I had taken on the interim position after all this hard work had been done by our providers. So that work was very successful. And during that time, we were also able to find people permanent housing. So the work continued. Although it didn't continue in some cases on site, the work did continue, and folks were successful in finding housing for people. So as we do continue our work here, regardless of I'm going to say it this way, regardless of our numbers, as folks enter our shelters, we are working with people to find them permanent housing. That I think was the biggest change during my time as commissioner. We had a homeless response system that managed homelessness, and we really changed our system to become a system that focused on exiting people from homelessness.
When we talk about the homeless, people that are experiencing homelessness now, how many people are we talking about that are unsheltered today, Yvonne?
Let me take a look at our unsheltered numbers. I mean, overall, we look when we look at some of our numbers, we do see that overall we have around 2,000 people who are experiencing homelessness in the state. So what percentage of that? And I am sorry that I don't have, I'm sorry, here, 429 are unsheltered. So we have around 2,100 folks who are sheltered, and about 429 folks who are unsheltered.
And when we look at those numbers even closer, when we think about, as you mentioned earlier, the importance of helping families that are experiencing homelessness and the impact on children, what do we know there, Yvonne?
Well, the impact is clearly great. When you don't have a home, you can't go to school. So what you'll see is a high absence rate among children who are homeless or living in a homeless shelter. So once you have an address and you have a home, clearly going to school, getting on the bus and going to school is something more easily done. So the impact is great. What we know is down the line, these children continue to have challenges, whether they're learning challenges, behavioral challenges, they continue to occur. So certainly capturing a family before they fall into homelessness, or ensuring that their homeless state, if you will, is very brief, it certainly pays off in terms of the children and their academic and personal success down the line.
In 2020, data showed there were 577 children under the age of 17 who were experiencing homelessness in Connecticut. We got a tweet from someone who had mentioned that landlords do not want to rent to people without a job. And so when we think about all the factors that lead to homelessness, can you talk about the point that Stephen made and what's being done on that front?
So yes, and certainly we have programs where we can provide, and there are a number of state programs and emergency programs that do provide security deposits and help with rental assistance. So we certainly understand, but importantly, helping folks who don't have employment. But providing them with rental assistance as quickly as we can and helping them, certainly that will lead to a job. I'd like to say it this way, Connecticut for quite a while has been a housing first state. And what that means is that we believe once you have a home, all things come. So you have a house, you now have an address that you can put on an employment application, right? You have an apartment, you have an address that you can put on an employment application. And we do have rental assistance to help folks with security deposits as well as rent for them to secure a job and then be able to pay their rent in the future.
We're talking about homelessness in our state here on Where We Live. My guest is Yvonne Klein, CEO of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. She's a former housing commissioner for the state of Connecticut. You can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. When I was asking about the ability to house some individuals in hotels, motels during the height of the pandemic, when we think about that access, are they still prioritized to receive other services through this vetting system that you had mentioned, Yvonne?
Well, it's once you are in our homeless system, we do assist everyone who is in our system with housing. So we have staff who works with every individual and family. So regardless if you became homeless during the pandemic or you were homeless prior to the pandemic and then you were hoteled, our providers continue to work with you until you're housed, whether it's trying to collect documents, connect matching you to housing. We work with you throughout that phase of getting you from homelessness to a home.
And how much is homelessness costing the state per person, per family?
Well, those numbers, I have those numbers from back in my commissioner days, and I think the most recent numbers that I have are from 2018. So a homeless family, if you quote unquote keep a family homeless, it costs the state about $100,000 a year. It's expensive. If you were to give that same family a housing voucher, it's about $33,000 a year. So clearly there is an economic cost to the state, but also a human cost to the state or a social cost to the state. Once families or individuals who are previously homeless have a home, they become part of a community, the children become part of the school community and, continue with their education. People grow roots in a community and become contributors. So the outcomes are far better in providing a voucher than keeping folks in a public system where they, may be cycling in and out of emergency rooms. In some cases, our justice system. So we have better outcomes when we house people quickly, but it is quite costly to the state.
You're hearing Yvonne Klein again here on Where We Live, CEO of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. We're going to continue talking with her after the break. We're also going to hear from the executive director of a shelter in Milford. And later, affordable housing remains a big issue that needs to be addressed in Connecticut. We'll get an update from Connecticut Public's housing reporter, Camila Vallejo. That's later. You can join us too. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about homelessness in Connecticut. Later this month, the annual Point in Time count begins. It focuses on people living in shelters and transitional housing, also those who are unsheltered. Now, one of the emergency shelters in our state is Bethel Center in the greater Milford community. It's year-round, and it has 34 beds, but from November to April, it's a no-free shelter with an additional 40 beds, and it also operates a soup kitchen. Its executive director joins us now on Zoom, Jennifer Paradis. Jennifer, welcome to our show.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Before we learn about how you're helping people who are experiencing homelessness, I wanted to learn a little bit about you. I understand that when you were younger, you also experienced homelessness. What would you like to share with us?
Yeah, and this just adds to kind of the everyday experience of myself as a provider. And there are so many providers out there that take their lived experience with them every day. So as I was growing up, a high school student about the age of 14 and a half, my parents were, their home was foreclosed on. I grew up in Bloomfield. My parents were both working class and, tried very desperately to maintain that home. And that became more and more difficult. And when the foreclosure happened, we all kind of went our separate ways, if you will. I wanted to stay in school and in my community. My parents really needed to be able to work and get back on their feet. And so I, went on this journey for a few years of couch surfing and relying on my dear friends and the families of my friends. I say that I was raised by so many moms, including my own, and my parents for a few years during my high school period were unsheltered. I remember visiting my dad at work one day and seeing they had a van at the time and just seeing the bed in the back of the van, and it hit me at that time what they were experiencing. And it wasn't until later on in my adult life that I was able to kind of process and understand what was happening to me at that time too. At that time, it was just the grind, if you will, as a high school student. And then I thankfully went on to college, many thanks to all those moms out there, but that helped me on my way. But I was then, one of the 15% or so college students who are homeless or housing unstable during their college years. And so worked on campus and lived on campus. And when there were breaks or periods of time when school was not in session, really struggled to find that stability over that period of time. And so thankfully with a degree and with a job, I was able to secure my first apartment after college, and then start really processing that experience and recognizing just how unfortunately common it is for young people in this state and across the country.
I'm sorry that happened to you. That's a lot to experience as a young person, but important to hear stories like yours, Jennifer, thinking about how so many families are just a paycheck or life situation away from experiencing homelessness. And that's why it's important to have these support systems in place to help people.
Absolutely, and I think what my experience is certainly adds value to my everyday as we're doing at work at the Bethel Center, and but it also helps to challenge the stereotypes that we have of families and individuals experiencing homelessness and housing instability. In my case, I had two parents. They were both very, very hardworking individuals, and really just trying to build wealth with home ownership, as we are kind of prescribed to do in this culture. And so they thought they were doing everything right. And so, really challenge the stereotypes of who was impacted by homelessness, where and when. And you're so right. We kind of live in a fragile economic environment, and it truly can happen to anyone. And we are seeing that today with the pandemic.
You're hearing Jennifer Paradis here on Where We Live, Executive Director of the Bethel Center in Milford. So tell us about what you've seen at the center, especially in the last 2 years. There's a spike, of course, for needing support in this pandemic. What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, kind of starting just before the pandemic, if we could. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that the homeless response system is an emergency crisis response system. It is not a natural thing or normal thing for individuals, families, veterans, youth to be experiencing homelessness. And so when individuals are, that is a crisis system. So our system is kind of built to respond quickly, efficiently, to make that experience for that individual or family rare, brief, and hopefully one time. And so why I mentioned that is kind of we were operating at full capacity, full steam ahead before the pandemic, and so. As this kind of overlay came, this kind of additional heightened urgency, and many of our programs are kind of modeled in congregate settings, and truly not funded in the ways that we would like to see in order to ensure that these programs environmentally are safe and healthy for the individuals that are participating in them. We had a very steep, quick learning curve at the very beginning of this pandemic on what we needed our system to have in terms of resources and staffing to respond. So kind of environmentally, how do we make these spaces safe and healthy for our folks? But also in addition to that, the pandemic really turned the lights on to just how many folks were experiencing housing instability in our communities, and just how quickly those folks slipped into the homeless response system. And so in the greater Milford community, we certainly saw individuals who were accessing our system for the first time. And so had many questions around what this was, what was happening, very, very traumatic experience to new households who, for medical reasons or for employment, loss of employment, or were doubled up and kind of had fragile, unstable housing situations in the first place. Those safety nets kind of came undone, and so they ended up, at our front door looking for assistance. But what I'll say too is that there were so many individuals in our system at the very beginning of the pandemic who had been experiencing homelessness for a significant period of time, and so what we also saw were those most vulnerable continuing to be. Speaking about folks experiencing unsheltered homelessness, we saw increases in that population slightly before the pandemic, and that was only exacerbated by the circumstances of the pandemic. So, what we're seeing is really that it's this convergence of, really needing to have political will, legislative way, community support around and commitment to ending homelessness in each and every community in Connecticut. And then also this much broader need to address this work as a public health crisis and a public health response. And unfortunately, we're still in this. We don't know kind of where this is taking us. We certainly have concerns and are vulnerable to all of the conditions that impact our system, things like the eviction moratorium, and just the ongoing health and wellness of our communities. Our system is vulnerable to those pieces.
And Jennifer, you were talking about the newly homeless that the Bethel Center has helped or is still helping because of this pandemic. Can you talk more about who we're talking about here? Are they young adults? Are they senior citizens? Are we seeing more families? Or is it across the board from all these different age groups?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's across the board. I mean, what I'll say is that we have the emergency response system. We have those individuals who are experiencing homelessness or at the very front door of that system today. But we also have, and Yvonne spoke about this, kind of a much broader circle around that emergency response of individuals and households that are housing unstable, that are cost burdened, whose housing expenses are in their monthly budgets exceed, we say 30%, but now housing expenses are exceeding 50, 60, 70, even 80% in some cases that we see. And so that impacts some individuals kind of first. Again, going back to those most vulnerable continue to be. So they're seniors, they're adults living with disabilities that are on fixed incomes. And don't have the options of going out and getting another job or doubling up with somebody and sharing rent. And so we certainly saw individuals who were in that situation and kind of making do in that situation, but how it's a house of cards. We certainly saw those folks too. We also have a number of families throughout the state that are doubled up and either are doubled up in apartments or homes or utilizing things that are considered temporary housing like hotels. And so the pandemic certainly hit those households where landlords or property managers of these places we're really concerned about congregation of people. And so, kind of broke up those households. And so if you weren't on the lease or if you weren't current on what your kind of accountability was in that situation, you were asked to leave. And so we certainly saw, we continue to see a lot of situations, unfortunately, that are like that. It really kind of comes back to what the economics of that home were before the pandemic and who was responsible for those. Unfortunately, we've seen way too many households that have slipped into homelessness because of the death of somebody because of COVID-19. Maybe they were the primary breadwinner. Or shared the expenses in the home, or kind of subsequent to households that had to break apart because they just couldn't afford to maintain the housing that they had. So I'm so happy that we're having this conversation that connects homelessness to housing affordability because those are inextricably linked. If you are interested and committed to ending homelessness in our communities, we have to be interested and committed to developing affordable housing in our communities.
Jennifer, I'm glad you made that point because you'd mentioned earlier about also the need for legislative will. And so when we think about Milford, that's in New Haven County, right next door to Fairfield County, one of the wealthiest parts of Connecticut and in the country, is there, when you think about affordability, the ability to have more multifamily housing in Milford, I mean, what does that look like locally? Are people interested in that, seeing that expanded?
That's I think the upside of the pandemic, and you're very right in terms of the expenses of housing in our community in Milford, being that we are kind of vulnerable to that New York City sprawl, and certainly saw prices increase as New York City, as New Yorkers came and continued to come into Connecticut. And wanted that kind of beautiful shoreline charm. And so we have a lot of wonderful things to offer in our community. And what I've seen in the pandemic is again, kind of the lights coming on. People kind of understanding that as housing increased, as housing costs increase, more and more folks were impacted by that and started to get concerned about their own budgets and their own ability to maintain their housing, and then started asking questions about how their parents or their friends' parents are maintaining housing, how their kids are able to remain in the communities that they grew up in and wanted to return to, and those other groups of people that I mentioned before. And so what we've seen and what I've seen is really a lot more organizing and interest around understanding just how you develop housing that is safe and stable, and a reflection of what each community needs. Milford is really considered to be an affluent community, and that's certainly true. But it's also a very diverse community that needs a diverse amount of housing stock. And so when I talk about affordable housing, I really like to talk about that we need more housing, period. Right now, at this time, we have individuals who, like myself, are, single, who, are employed, and shopping in the same market as somebody who's coming out of our programs with a housing voucher, because there's just simply not enough housing diversity for everyone. So we absolutely need those 80,000 plus affordable housing units for people who are on fixed incomes and need that stabilization of the rental market. But will also help alleviate those burdens is to make sure that there's enough housing, period, no matter what phase of life you're in.
Yvonne Klein is still with us, CEO of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. Yvonne, I'd love to hear your perspective as we talk about the need also to expand affordable housing, how this is an important part of the equation to end homelessness in our state.
Well, yes. And I think, Lucy, you had mentioned that there's a report from the Department of Housing where we have a shortage of 86,000 units of affordable housing in the state, or that's the need that we have in the state, which may in fact even be greater. So what we have seen, and part of the work that we did at the department, and as I had mentioned earlier, it was the full housing spectrum, everything from working on ending homelessness to creating and supporting home ownership and everything in between. So clearly the pandemic, as Jennifer and you have pointed out, that the pandemic certainly highlighted the gaps in our communities. And for many years, I have been a champion and been working to create more affordable housing across the state, and having had success in that as commissioner. But there are so many things that we can do, as we see across all of our communities, and even our wealthier communities like Darien and Ridgefield, where we see about 30% of our population here is housing cost burden, which was actually very surprising to many of us to learn those kinds of facts. So, creating incentives and certainly changing some of our zoning, which we saw at the last legislative session, to see zoning changes enacted first in a very, very long time, certainly is putting us on the road to creating more affordable housing across the state.
We'll be talking more about that coming up here on Where We Live. When we look back at your time as first select woman in Darien, Yvonne, and we hear this also from other towns who talk about increasing affordable housing. Often that can be one-bedroom apartments, more suitable for the elderly than for families. And so is that something that you want to see improved on now that you're on the nonprofit side as this conversation continues in our state, Yvonne?
Well, we really need all size bedroom homes to address this lack of affordable housing. So certainly here in Darien, I was fortunate to support during the early time the expansion of what was formerly known as Allen O'Neill, which is now the Heights, which also has some 3-bedroom units. Clearly, we have a need for units, affordable units with more than one bedroom. So when we look at who's challenged, it's families of all sizes. So that's the kind of housing I support in building, so that we have more choices in affordable housing, whether it's deed restricted or not deed restricted. But certainly what we know are the more vibrant communities are multi-generational communities, so that we're attracting people of all ages, not just the elderly. I think it's an easy, what we used to see, it's a quote unquote easy sell to communities that we, of course, we want to keep our folks in town who have lived here for decades and who have contributed and built our communities. Of course, we want to keep our folks here in our towns. But as they move on to a smaller home, we also want to attract younger families to come into our towns to make sure that they're vibrant and have a variety of housing options from which to choose, so that we can attract folks of all cultures, income levels, and ethnicities and diversity.
That's Yvonne Klein, CEO of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, here on Where We Live. I want to thank Jennifer Paradis for joining us. She's the executive director of the Beth El Center in Milford. We'll be sure to tweet out a link to this shelter on our website if you want to learn more, and also on our social media. Thank you, Jennifer, for your time.
Thank you, Lucy.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Again, coming up, we're going to continue talking about homelessness and how it all ties to also a lack of affordable housing in our state. More after a short break. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we've been focused on homelessness in our state. Challenges remain that contribute to housing instability. A lack of affordable housing is a big factor. As we've mentioned on the show already, a report by the State Department of Housing says Connecticut has a shortage of 86,000 affordable rental units. For more on this, joining us now is Connecticut Public's housing reporter, Camila Vallejo. Camila, welcome back to the show.
Morning, Lucy. Thank you so much for having me.
So we know that affordable housing and zoning were big topics last legislative session. A lot of controversy also surrounding the conversations about local control and making changes to zoning. So tell us more about that dynamic and what's expected to come up this legislative session. What do we know?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's fair to say that there's, tension between the state and towns when it comes to zoning reform and its potential to boost affordable housing stock across towns. Like you mentioned, we saw that a lot the last legislative session, when really what it is that some people believe the state should be more involved in zoning, excuse me, and should have a say in what kind of developments we have. And on the flip side, others believe that zoning should remain completely local because the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't meet everybody's need, given the diversity of towns that we see in Connecticut. And I think we're going to continue to see that this upcoming legislative session. And, I'm happy to give you a brief overview of what we saw last legislative session and how it's still affecting us today. So House Bill 6107, passed a variety of different things. But I think two important things to highlight are the fact that it made statewide changes to the minimum parking spaces we require for new developments and how we allow accessory dwelling units or in-law apartments in our towns. So at the last minute, given this tension that we're talking about, the legislature included opt-out provisions for towns in case, in the end, they didn't want to, follow this. And, so far speaking to a handful of towns in Fairfield County, many have plans to opt out or have already opted out because, again, they say that this one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't fit their needs.
Camila, with this opt-out being permitted, how does that really move the needle into, getting more affordable housing units in communities, again, that are outside our major cities?
Absolutely. So I think it's too early to tell whether it's really going to move the needle. For these both mandates that I mentioned previously, towns have until 2023 to opt out. So, we still have some time where they're able to make the decision. And it's important to note that they need 2/3 of their zoning board and 2/3 of their legislative board to actually opt out of this. So there is some challenge for towns if they aren't able to gather all those votes. But, even if they do in the end opt out, I think advocates are at least saying that, this statewide mandates at least inspired towns to maybe look at, legislation in their towns that otherwise they might have not looked at before.
Let's talk more about the reporting you've done on what affordable housing looks like right now in Connecticut, and the fact that for many, affordable housing is still not affordable, even with a government subsidy. You spoke to a Bridgeport resident, Dion Dwyer, who lives in public housing. This is part of what she shared with you.
When I found out about it, it was through a friend. And when she told me about it, I didn't even know where to find it. Honestly, I lived on the east side of Bridgeport. It was still in Bridgeport. I just wasn't aware of it. I thought it would be a good place to start getting back on my feet, something to level me out so I can provide for my kids. It might have saved me as far as not being homeless, but at the same time, I'm stuck here.
So what does she mean there that she's stuck in terms of where she's living now, Camila?
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as her current housing situation, she's been there for over 20 years. And like she mentioned, it may have kept her from being homeless, but it's just not ideal, living conditions for her and her family. She stated environmental issues, she stated maintenance issues, she stated conflict with different residents that really has just motivated her to try to find other options. But again, we get back to that lack of options, that shortage that we're seeing across the state. Because of that very shortage, she isn't able to branch out to other units that are affordable to her within her budget and offer her different options. She currently lives in Bridgeport, and she would like to branch out to other areas of Fairfield County where she can find better opportunities. But given the very high cost of rent, she simply can't.
We've mentioned that statistic from that Department of Housing report. 86,000 affordable housing units are needed that Connecticut doesn't have at the moment. What about the data on the number of housing permits issued and how that might help expand the inventory of housing, Camila?
Yes, Lucy. So I think it's important to note that nearly 90,000 unit shortage is for those who are very low income. So it's those who are 0 to 30%, those who make 0 to 30% area median income. What we're also seeing across the state is that there's a shortage of high income housing. So like Jennifer mentioned earlier, the need is just need for more housing, period, because not having enough housing for different income bands just boils down to them, fighting for less expensive housing, and there's none to go around for everyone. But then specifically looking at housing permits, according to available data, it shows that Connecticut permitted around 3,300 housing units last year. That's the lowest since 2011. That's raw data from the Department of Economic and Community Development. And that just gives us a glimpse of what we're going to see when the final data is out in May. But in the end, not enough production just continues to contribute to the shortage. And I think we're seeing that lack of production specifically due to the pandemic. We're seeing labor shortage. We're seeing supply chain issues. Lumber, for example, is really expensive, which is essential to new housing production. So, we might continue to see these low numbers.
And did you mean that there's a surplus of high-income housing, Camila?
Yes. No, sorry. There's a decrease in high-income housing, according to the same data from the Department of Housing that found that we were short nearly 90,000 units for low-income residents.
Yvonne Klein is still with us, CEO of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. Yvonne, we have a few minutes left. Camila doing a good job of giving us this overview of where things stand. And so, again, in your new role as a leader of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, what do you want to see in this legislative session to continue to talk about the expansion of affordable housing in our state?
So focusing on affordable housing, clearly, I think we need to continue the work in supporting good zoning legislation. I think what we may be looking at is some legislation focusing around our transit districts, which would be quite good for folks along Metro North and also our major transit lines. Last year, this was something that had come up and was dropped. So we might see some legislation focused called on our transit-oriented communities, which would be very exciting because the housing near transit, especially multifamily housing, would be key to folks having housing options. I think overall, as we've seen and as Camila certainly aptly reported, that as you did, Lucy, that last year was very contentious. And what we know here in Connecticut is that we can end homelessness in the state of Connecticut, and we can actually address and provide more housing choice in the state of Connecticut, and garnering more support across the board from all of us in the suburbs as well as our cities will create a more vibrant Connecticut.
We just have a couple of minutes left. I believe under Governor Malloy, I think $1.3 billion was set aside to help with expanding affordable housing. What do you want to see specifically in this administration in terms of how, money is allocated to expand housing for people who are low income or struggling, Yvonne?
Well, certainly there are opportunities within programs that the state does offer to put forward incentives and funding for low income housing. And, certainly I know there have been some challenges during the pandemic, but holding bond commission to ensure that the money that the State Department of Housing has is actually getting on the street, if you will, and these housing units being built. That's really crucial. Meeting with developers, as a matter of fact, just yesterday can take anywhere from 3 to 10 years to see fruition of a development. So the sooner we can get the funding out on the street, the sooner we can get the housing built. So certainly having a robust capital line item with respect to the Department of Housing to build housing, and also supporting CHAFA. CHAFA's initiatives are clearly important.
And that's the CHAFA, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. Yvonne, we'd love to have you come back. This is an important topic, definitely not just for one show. So we're going to continue talking about housing affordability in our state. Yvonne Klein, CEO of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. Thank you for your time today. Also with us on the phone was Camila Vallejo, Connecticut Public's housing reporter. Camila, thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Today's show produced by Sujata Srinivasan. Our technical director is Kat Pastor. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.